Dawn stretched lazily over the canyon, a pale wash of rose and amber spilling across the mesas, and the wind whispered secrets through the tall, dry grass. Dust rose in thin spirals from the hooves of horses grazing near the corral, catching the first light like tiny golden sparks. The rancher walked the land quietly, boots scuffing the earth, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn coat. He moved as though trying not to disturb the world, his eyes tracing the horizon, noting the crooked fence posts, the silver glint of water in the trough, and the distant ridges where the sky met the earth in perfect silence. He was a man of few words, though not unkind. Loneliness had carved deep channels in the corners of his mouth, softened the edges of his laughter. The ranch had always been a refuge and a burden, a place that demanded attention at every hour and yet offered little in return besides the steady rhythm of work. He had managed alone for years, but lately the chores felt heavier, the nights longer, and the quiet more echoing than comforted. Then came a knock on the door. Light, polite, deliberate. She stood in the doorway when he opened it, tall and steady, her figure framed by the doorway like a painting. She carried a bag slung across her shoulder, the weight of it unassuming. There was a calmness in her presence that made the air seem to still. She did not rush, did not look around with anxious curiosity. She simply looked at him with eyes that held a quiet certainty, the kind of certainty that belonged to someone who had seen more than her share of storms and had learned how to bend without breaking. "I heard you might need help," she said, voice soft, deliberate, carrying the accent of the land she came from, the deep rhythms of the Navajo people. He blinked, unsure whether to offer a hand or simply nod. His life had been predictable, framed by routines and solitude, and suddenly, there was a ripple in its surface. Something about her commanded attention without demanding it, something that quietly challenged his habit of mistrust. I do," he said finally, words sounding clumsy in the dawn air. "We'll need someone who can cook, mend fences, feed the stock." His voice trailed off, unsure how much to add. She nodded, unshaken, and set her bag down carefully. "I can manage all of that," she said, with a confidence that was quiet but not soft. Not many could hold such weight and still move with grace. The rancher studied her for a moment, noting the way the morning light caught in her hair, the way her eyes shifted calmly across the horizon, taking in the land as though she had known it all her life. She carried herself with a strength that spoke of quiet endurance, a strength that was not built on intimidation or noise, but on patience, experience, and an understanding of the world's rhythms. He finally stepped aside, gesturing toward the house. "Come on in then," he said, his words more invitation than command. The kitchen smelled faintly of wood smoke and earth. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, falling on the worn wooden floorboards and the chipped enamel of the stove. She moved with a slow grace, unpacking her bag, laying out simple tools, and inspecting the pantry as if reading the history of the house in the grain of the shelves. He watched her from the doorway, fascinated by the quiet efficiency, the way she seemed to become part of the room rather than dominate it. They worked in silence at first, a shared rhythm of preparation. She stirred the porridge. He carried water from the well. There was no conversation, but there was understanding, small gestures of recognition, a nod, a glance, a hand brushing against flour-dusted counters. It was a dance of familiarity, yet unfamiliarity, like two strangers learning a language they almost instinctively understood. Outside, the ranch breathed around them. Horses snorted softly, the wind rustled through the tall grass, and the sun climbed higher, casting shadows that stretched and receded like slow-moving thoughts. Even the dust seemed to shimmer with possibility, caught between the waking earth and the stirring sky. By midday, they sat to eat in quiet companionship. She had cooked simply cornmeal biscuits, fresh eggs, and bacon crisp just so. He noticed the care in every detail, the way she had arranged the food, the way the coffee smelled stronger than usual, warming the kitchen with its bitter comfort. "Good," he said, though the word felt small. She nodded slightly, acknowledging the praise without need for words. The moment was not about accolades, but about recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of skill and effort, a mutual understanding that this day, this meal, was the beginning of something neither could yet name. He noticed things he had not before. The way she held herself tall, even when bending to stir the pot. The faint smile she allowed herself when a biscuit came out just right. The calmness in her eyes, even as the wind rattled the windows. She seemed larger than the space she occupied, not physically only, but in presence, in gravity, in the quiet authority she carried. For his part, the rancher felt something stir within him, a curious blend of apprehension and fascination. He was used to solitude, to the comfort of routine, to the predictability of empty spaces. Yet here was a presence that invited him into a rhythm he did not yet know, a rhythm that demanded attention not through words or force, but through quiet, unwavering confidence. The afternoon moved slowly. She tended to the animals, showing patience and steadiness, coaxing the horses, checking fences with careful hands, while he observed from a distance. There was no need for instruction. She knew what to do. And yet, in her silent movements, there was a generosity of spirit, a willingness to meet the land and its keeper where they were, without judgment, without pretense. He began to see her not as a stranger, not merely as a hired hand, but as someone who belonged to the land in a way that mirrored his own quiet attachment. There was no rush, no pressure, only the slow unfurling of recognition. Two people, separate but linked, learning to inhabit the same space with respect and subtle curiosity. As the sun dipped low in the sky, painting the mesas with gold and shadow, the rancher found himself wondering what it would be like to know her, truly know her, beyond the chores and the silent companionship of work. He did not speak the thought aloud. Words were not yet necessary. But he carried it with him as he filled the water troughs, felt the wind, and watched the last lights slip away behind the distant ridges. Night settled softly over the ranch, and the first stars appeared, timid at first, then bold against the velvet sky. She moved through the house with quiet purpose, preparing for the evening, and he felt an unfamiliar lightness, a sense that the weight of his loneliness had eased just slightly, as if the world had shifted imperceptibly to make room for something new. They did not speak of what had passed between them, nor did they need to. The day had spoken for them, through work, through gestures, through the silent understanding that had grown like tendrils of morning mist over the desert. And as he finally closed the door and leaned against it, listening to the wind in the grass and the distant lowing of cattle, he knew the quiet truth. This week would change everything, though neither of them yet knew how. The horizon held promise, and the night air smelled of possibility. Somewhere in the stillness, life had begun to stir in ways the rancher could not yet name, and he realized, with a strange mixture of apprehension and hope, that he would follow it wherever it led. Morning came again with the smell of sagebrush and the soft hum of birds waking across the mesas. The rancher moved through his chores with familiar precision, but the world had shifted subtly overnight. There was a presence now in the kitchen, a warmth that lingered even before she appeared at the doorway. The cook had settled into the rhythm of the ranch, her hands skilled, her steps deliberate, and though she spoke little, every motion carried assurance, a quiet authority that made the air feel steadier. She had prepared breakfast before he reached the table. The smell of fresh bread, eggs just golden enough, and coffee that steamed like liquid amber filled the kitchen. He paused, hand on the doorframe, watching her work. It was a simple scene, yet charged with gentle gravity. She hummed softly, a melody that seemed to belong to the wind and the sun, and he felt a strange pull in the chest he had long forgotten existed. The first words of the day were clipped, functional, exchanged over the clatter of pans and the low hiss of the stove. Yet in those words lay a subtle rhythm of familiarity, a mutual recognition that their days were now intertwined. She noticed the small things he overlooked, a chipped mug, a loose floorboard, the way the horses shied at the distant howl of coyote, and corrected them without fanfare. They spoke little of their pasts. There was no need to force stories into words. The life they carried in their silences said more. Still, glimpses surfaced, soft and fleeting, like smoke curling toward the morning light. He noticed the careful way she tied her hair back, the faint scars along her forearms that hinted at past struggles, and he wondered at the stories she carried without uttering them. She noticed the lines around his eyes, the slight stiffness in his shoulders, and perhaps understood, without need of words, the weight of solitude he bore like a second skin. The ranch was alive with quiet activity. Horses nickered in the paddock, the wind carried the scent of hay and sun-baked earth, and the distant mountains held the day like a slow, breathing heart. They worked side by side, mending fences, tending the livestock, checking the water troughs, a silent choreography born of shared purpose. He began to notice the grace in her movements, the way she handled the animals with a calm that coaxed trust from creatures often skittish. The horses leaned into her touch, their ears swiveling to the gentle words she murmured. There was laughter, too, quiet and unhurried. When a fence post refused to bend, she teased it softly, coaxing it into place as if speaking to an old friend. He chuckled, a rare, deep sound, watching her and feeling a lightness in his chest that surprised him. The moment was small, but it carried weight, the subtle recognition that joy could exist in the smallest interactions, in the shared rhythm of work, in the understanding that neither of them needed to perform for the other. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of amber and rose, they sat outside on the weathered porch. The cook passed him a cup of coffee, her hands warm and steady against the cool ceramic. He took it, holding it longer than necessary, savoring the moment. They watched the horses graze, the horizon folding into itself, the wind stirring the tall grass in slow, whispering waves. "You've got quiet hands," he said finally, almost to himself. They move steady, like they know their place. She glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Hands learn," she said softly. "If they're given time and care, they remember." And in that exchange, so simple and understated, a bridge formed between them. It was not yet friendship, not yet trust, but a delicate thread, invisible and fragile, that promised something more if nurtured. Days passed in a montage of small gestures. He noticed she left a steaming cup of coffee for him each morning, a quiet gift that spoke of awareness and thoughtfulness. She noticed his hesitation in speaking, the way he sometimes retreated into silence, and she allowed him space without judgment. They moved together through chores, sharing the same rhythm, noticing the same subtleties, a loose plank, a shying horse, the first bloom of wildflowers in the meadow. Occasionally, neighbors or passing ranch hand appeared. Their remarks were often clipped, sometimes tinged with skepticism. Some whispered at the presence of a woman working alone alongside the rancher, underestimating her strength, unaware of the quiet authority she wielded. She met them with calm dignity, her eyes steady, her words measured. The rancher noticed her grace under scrutiny and felt a warmth he had not felt in years, a growing admiration, not for beauty alone, but for the resilience and quiet courage she carried like a cloak around her shoulders. In the evenings, after the chores were done, they often lingered near the fire. Embers glowed faintly, casting flickering shadows across the wooden floor. She hummed softly while tidying. He sat with his elbows on his knees, watching, listening. There were no grand declarations, no hurried confessions, only the gentle unfolding of attention, the awareness that their lives were intersecting in ways neither had anticipated. One night, a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder rumbled low, shaking the mountains, and rain began to fall in soft sheets, drumming on the tin roof of the barn. The cook moved quickly, securing the animals, checking fences, and guiding him through the small tasks with calm precision. He found himself following her instructions, trusting her judgment without question, feeling a new sense of reliance and gratitude. The storm passed, leaving the land washed and glistening, and as they stood on the porch, soaked and windblown, he caught the way her hair clung to her face, the way her eyes shone with quiet determination. "Never thought a storm could feel like this," he murmured, half to himself. "Storms are honest," she replied softly. "They show us what we're made of." And in that honesty, in the simplicity of shared experience, he began to feel a shift within himself. He saw her not merely as a hired hand, but as someone who could stand beside him in the quiet and the chaos alike, someone whose presence demanded not dominance, but respect and recognition. Moments of tenderness grew, small and unassuming. A hand brushing accidentally against his as she handed him tools. A shared glance over the fence as horses nickered nearby. Laughter spilling softly from the kitchen when a pot threatened to boil over. These were not grand gestures, but they carried weight. The weight of recognition, of shared humanity, of the beginnings of trust. He remembered the days before her arrival. Long, empty, punctuated only by the rhythm of chores and the distant howl of coyotes. Now, even in silence, the ranch felt different. Lighter, somehow more attuned. Her presence brought a sense of balance, a quiet warmth that wrapped around the corners of his life like sunlight spilling over the edge of a canyon. And she, too, noticed him differently. He began to reveal himself in small ways, through gestures, through pauses, through the way he tended to the land. She watched him move through the morning, the afternoon, the quiet evening light, and understood. Not all strength is loud. Not all courage is visible. There is bravery in patience, in observation, in the willingness to hold one's heart carefully, without forcing it. By the end of the week, a subtle bond had formed between them. It was delicate, not yet named, but undeniable. Trust had been sown in small, quiet acts, in shared meals, in chores completed side by side, in moments of laughter and recognition. They had discovered a rhythm together, one that was both gentle and profound, and it felt as though the land itself had acknowledged the union. As the sun set, painting the sky in bruised pinks and golds, the rancher paused on the porch, watching her move gracefully across the yard, tending the animals one last time before night fell. There was a moment of stillness, where the world seemed to hold its breath, and he felt a new, understanding bloom within him. She had arrived, quietly, unassuming, and yet she had shifted everything. The weight of his solitude, the rhythm of his days, the quiet spaces of his heart. He did not know what the coming days would bring, but he sensed, with a certainty he had not felt in years, that life had begun to unfold differently now. Something had started in the space between them, subtle yet powerful, and he knew it would continue to grow, as natural and unstoppable as the wind across the plains. The night air carried the faint scent of rain on earth and would smoke from the hearth. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote's call echoed, and the stars began to pierce the velvet sky. In that moment, he felt a rare peace, a quiet understanding that the world, despite its harsh edges, had made room for something gentle, something real. And she, standing near the barn, pausing to watch the horizon, felt it too. The pull of connection, the silent acknowledgement of trust and subtle admiration that had quietly taken root between them. The week had passed almost without notice, but it had changed everything. The week had settled over the ranch like a quiet, steady tide. Days flowed together, measured by the rising sun, the lowing of cattle, and the gentle rhythm of chores. The rancher had begun to notice changes he could not name. In himself, in the way the land felt, in the subtle shifts in the kitchen and the barn. There was a presence now, steady and strong, that softened the edges of his solitude. She moved with the certainty of someone who had faced storms and returned, unbroken. Yet beneath that quiet strength, he sensed layers of unspoken stories, traces of hardship, glimmers of laughter, hints of sorrow tucked carefully beneath the calm exterior. He found himself watching her in small, silent moments, wondering at the resilience she carried like a second skin. It was during one such morning that the first true test of trust arrived. The neighboring rancher, a wiry man with a sharp tongue and narrow eyes, had ridden up with a question and a complaint about a fence line. His voice carried a mixture of suspicion and derision as he observed the cook tending to the livestock. "You let her handle things?" he asked, his tone laced with disbelief. The rancher felt his jaw tighten, but did not speak. His eyes flicked to her, silently seeking guidance, reassurance, some sign of readiness for this confrontation. She did not falter. She straightened, tall and calm, and answered with quiet confidence, her voice steady, unafraid, yet measured. "I can manage this," she said simply, and then moved to show the neighboring rancher the problem, explaining with patience how the fence needed reinforcement and how the livestock were secure. There was no arrogance, no posturing, only the steady assurance of someone who knew what she was doing. The neighbor grunted, shifting uneasily, clearly unprepared for this quiet competence. He muttered a few words and rode away, leaving the rancher standing in silence, a slow swell of admiration rising in his chest. He realized, with a mixture of relief and awe, that she was not only capable, but extraordinary in ways he had not yet dared to acknowledge. That evening, a storm rolled over the plains, dark clouds moving like slow, deliberate shadows across the horizon. Rain began in fine threads, then thickened, turning the dirt paths to soft mud. Lightning etched jagged white across the sky, followed by low, rolling thunder that seemed to shake the bones of the earth. The rancher and the cook moved quickly, guiding the animals to shelter, checking fences that groaned under the weight of the wind. He found himself relying on her guidance, following her without question, trusting her judgment in ways he had not trusted anyone for years. "You need to move that post," she instructed softly, her voice calm amidst the chaos. "The wind will tear the pen apart if it's not secured." He obeyed, gripping the wood as rain soaked through his coat, and marveled at her poise. She moved with quiet authority, her hands sure, her mind steady, guiding the ranch through the storm as if it were a matter of course. And he, watching her, felt something shift in his heart, awe, respect, and an awareness of how deeply he had come to depend on her presence. After the storm, as they stood on the porch, soaked and shivering, the rancher finally found words that had been brewing quietly in the edges of his mind. "You handle that better than I could have," he admitted, voice low, almost a whisper. "I don't think I could have done alone." She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the damp light, and smiled faintly. "Sometimes we need help," she said simply. "Even the strongest hands aren't enough on their own." There was a silence then, not uncomfortable, but full of recognition, understanding, and the subtle weight of emotions neither yet dared to name. Days continued after the storm, but something had changed. The quiet moments between chores were charged with a new awareness. He noticed the way she lingered by the barn door, adjusting a strap or brushing her hair back, how her presence seemed to slow time around her. She noticed him noticing, yet did not retreat. Instead, she allowed it, as if giving permission for trust, for closeness, for the slow bloom of something more. One evening, after a long day of mending fences and feeding the animals, they sat near the fire. Embers glowed faintly, casting soft shadows that danced across the room. The cook hummed quietly while arranging the tools, the rhythm steady and soothing. He watched her hands, the way they moved with purpose, and for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something fragile and hopeful within himself. "You have a way of making things feel easier," he said finally, words breaking the silence like tentative light through clouds. She glanced at him, eyes gentle, understanding. "Easier isn't always about what we do," she said softly. "Sometimes it's about who we have beside us." Her words lingered in the air, resonating in the quiet of the room. He felt a warmth, a recognition, a subtle thrill that he had not experienced in years. The bond between them was no longer merely functional. It was emotional, delicate, unspoken, and powerful. Later that night, he found himself walking to the barn, drawn by the faint light she left burning inside. She looked up as he entered, eyes reflecting the glow of the lanterns. They did not speak immediately. Words were not necessary. He watched her move through the small tasks, and she allowed him to watch, sharing the space without intrusion. And then, without fanfare, without hurry, she did something he would not forget. She handed him a small cup of coffee, still warm, her fingers brushing his ever so lightly. The contact was fleeting, yet electric in its simplicity. He felt the tension of the past week, the uncertainty, the loneliness, the quiet admiration, coalesce in that brief moment. "You've earned this," she said softly. It was a gesture without words, yet it spoke volumes. It was care, recognition, trust, and perhaps something more, something that hovered just beyond the edge of understanding. He held the cup, feeling the heat seep into his fingers, and met her gaze. The firelight danced in her eyes, and in that instant, he realized the depth of his own feelings: admiration, awe, longing, and the slow, undeniable pull of affection. The following days carried a different rhythm. Work continued, chores repeated, but the spaces between them were now alive with subtle exchanges: a shared glance over a horse's back, the quiet passing of tools, the gentle teasing over breakfast. The rancher felt a growing sense of ease, a comfort he had not known in years, and he began to understand that trust could bloom slowly, in silence, in small gestures, in a mutual recognition of strength and kindness. Yet, even as intimacy grew, there was tension. He grappled with his own fears: the fear of losing control, the fear of vulnerability, the fear of daring to care. She, too, carried her own caution, a subtle wariness beneath the calm exterior. But instead of driving them apart, these fears drew them closer, creating a careful, deliberate dance of proximity and restraint, where every action was measured, every glance significant, every shared silence profound. By the end of the week, the rancher was acutely aware of the shift within himself. She had arrived quietly, carrying only a bag in her quiet authority, yet she had stirred something profound in the rhythm of his days. He found himself thinking of her in moments of solitude, wondering how her hands moved so deliberately, how her eyes held the calm of someone who had weathered storms without complaint, how her presence had made the vast, empty ranch feel less lonely, more alive. And then came the moment he would remember for the rest of his life. The storm returned unexpectedly, fiercer than before, threatening the livestock, rattling the fences, and sending him scrambling for safety. The cook moved with decisive calm, guiding him through the chaos with a clarity and courage he had never witnessed. She secured the animals, braved the wind and rain, and took command of the situation as naturally as breathing. Watching her in action, he realized, not for the first time, but with a clarity that took his breath, that she was not merely skilled, not merely brave, but extraordinary in the quietest, most unassuming ways. In that moment, he understood the truth of her presence. She was not just helping him manage the ranch. She had changed the very way he experienced it and the way he felt about life, about trust, about himself. The storm passed, leaving the land washed and glistening. They stood side by side, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to their faces, hearts still racing. He looked at her, and for the first time, he allowed himself to see her fully, not as a helper, not as a stranger, but as someone brave, steady, and luminous, whose presence had quietly claimed a place in his life and heart. He did not speak immediately. Words would have felt clumsy, inadequate. Instead, he simply reached out, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. Her eyes met his, and in that gaze, 1,000 unspoken emotions passed between them. Trust, respect, admiration, something tender and fragile, something that promised a future if nurtured with care. The week had ended, and with it came the understanding. Life on the ranch would never be the same again. Something had begun between them, subtle, profound, inevitable. It was only the beginning. The morning light came slowly that day, painting the canyon walls in muted gold and shadow. The ranch was quiet, almost deceptively so, as though it held its breath, waiting. The air smelled faintly of wet earth and sage, washed clean by the storm from the night before. But the calm was fragile, for nature, like life, often had a way of testing those who dared to live fully. The cook moved through the barnyard with her usual precision, checking the fences and ensuring the horses were calm. The rancher followed, alert to every sound, every shadow, every stir of movement in the distance. Something about the land felt restless, as if it too sensed that this day was different. It began subtly, the lowing of the cattle growing uneasy, a ripple of tension in the paddocks. Then came the snapping sound of a weakened fence post, the wind tearing at a loose panel. The storm had left its mark, and the ranch was vulnerable. Without hesitation, she sprang into action. Her hands moved decisively, her voice calm and commanding as she directed him and the ranch hands who had come to help. "Move the horses into the eastern pen," she instructed. "The wind will pick up again, and this side isn't secure." He followed, marveling at her clarity and composure. The fear and tension that had gripped him moments before faded, replaced by a quiet trust he had never known he could feel so deeply. In the midst of chaos, she was a steady hand, a guiding light, and he felt himself drawn to her, both in admiration and in the awakening stirrings of something far more tender. Then came the real test. A loose beam threatened to collapse near the feed storage, its timbers groaning under pressure. Without pause, she darted forward, steadying it with her hands while shouting instructions to the ranch hands. Rain and wind lashed at her, but she did not waver. The rancher's heart pounded as he realized the danger, but he also recognized her unwavering courage, the calm certainty that had quietly commanded his respect all week. "You need to hold it steady," he called, stepping forward to assist. But she shook her head, her eyes meeting his with a flash of determination. "I've got this. Keep the horses safe," she replied. And with that, she bore the weight of the collapsing beam, muscles straining, breath steady, a figure of quiet bravery against the storm. He watched, awestruck, feeling a surge of gratitude and awe unlike anything he had ever known. This was the moment the week had been building toward, the point where admiration and trust converged, where unspoken emotions found their truest form in action. The danger passed as quickly as it had arisen. The beam held, the fences stood, and the livestock were safe. The storm began to fade, leaving the air crisp, damp, and sparkling with the aftermath of rain. She stood, soaked and windblown, hair plastered to her face, chest heaving slightly from exertion, and he realized he had never seen someone so entirely themselves, strong, brave, and unpretentious. He stepped forward, heart hammering in his chest. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, brushing a wet strand of hair from her eyes. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting the remnants of the storm, and for a moment, the world held still. He began, struggling for words. "I don't know how to say this properly, but I'm grateful. More than I can say. You've saved more than the ranch today." Her gaze softened, and a faint smile touched her lips. "You didn't need saving," she said quietly. "Not in the way you think. We help each other, that's all." He felt something break gently inside him, the armor of solitude, the hesitation that had always held him back. He realized then that his admiration had grown into something deeper, something tender, vulnerable, and real. And he understood fully that she had changed him, quietly, profoundly, and irrevocably. The sun broke through the clouds in golden shafts, illuminating the wet grass and glinting on the fence posts. The world seemed to exhale, the tension of the morning dissipating in the soft light. They stood together, hands brushing, breaths mingling with the fresh scent of rain and earth, and he felt a surge of courage, the kind that comes from long months of quiet longing and patient observation. "Stay with me," he said finally, voice low, full of hope and something more, something he had almost forgotten he was capable of feeling. Her eyes held his for a long moment, searching, gentle, reflective, before she nodded. "I think I'd like that," she replied softly. It was not a grand declaration, not a hurried confession. It was simple, honest, and perfect in its timing. In that quiet exchange, a bond solidified, not just of affection, but of shared understanding, respect, and trust. They had earned it through small gestures, patience, bravery, and quiet companionship. Even the side characters seemed to sense the shift. The ranch hands, the neighbors who had once doubted, now watched with subtle acknowledgement, offering nods of respect. The world, often harsh and indifferent, had bent gently for this moment, recognizing the courage, kindness, and love that had quietly grown between two souls. That evening, the fire burned brightly in the hearth, casting warm amber light across the room. They sat together, not needing words, just sharing the comfort of presence, the gentle intimacy of hearts aligned. The rancher noticed the curve of her smile, the soft lift of her eyes, and he felt a fullness he had never imagined possible, a sense of home, not in the land alone, but in the person beside him. Outside, the wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and distant sage. The stars appeared gradually, timid at first, then bold against the velvet sky, as if celebrating the quiet triumph of human connection, bravery, and love. In that stillness, the rancher spoke, not to her, but to the night itself. Life has a way of surprising you, if you let it. She nodded, resting her hand over his. And sometimes the best things come quietly, when you're not looking for them at all. They stayed there, hands intertwined, watching the land they had tended, the horizon stretching wide and endless before them. There was no rush, no need for grandeur. Only the simple, profound understanding that they had found each other, and that the bond they shared was steady, true, and deep. The climax of the story was not in dramatic heroics or loud declarations, but in the quiet courage of the cook, the patient growth of the rancher, and the subtle, thrilling realization that two lives, when trusted and tended with care, could bloom together beautifully. And as the fire dwindled and the first chill of night settled over the ranch, the narrator, in the soft voice of memory and reflection, whispered, "Sometimes life moves in silence. Sometimes trust, patience, and gentle courage carry more weight than shouting and haste. And sometimes the most profound change comes quietly, like the wind over the plains, like rain washing the dust from the world, like two hearts learning to recognize each other without words." If you're listening to this story, remember that the quiet moments often hold the greatest power. Notice them, cherish them, and don't be afraid to let someone beside you quietly change your life. Life is full of storms, but it is also full of the gentle hands that guide us through them. And sometimes, in the calm after, you find that the greatest treasure was not just survival, but the unexpected companionship, trust, and love that grew in its midst. So, wherever you're watching this from, take a moment to reflect on the quiet bravery in your own life. Reach out to those who bring steady light into your days. And remember, the heart, when tended patiently and with care, blooms most beautifully in silence, in shared moments, in trust, and in kindness. And if this story brought a warmth to your heart, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. Share the moment with someone who might need it, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. For the rancher, the cook, and the quiet lands of the West, the world had shifted irrevocably and beautifully. And in the hush of twilight, with stars above and the wind carrying stories across the plains, they began a new chapter together, steady, tender, and endlessly full of possibility.